If you're enjoying haunted UK fiction, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or Ko-fi. Simply search for Haunted UK Podcast. At first sight, it looked like something had been wrapped in a sheet or blanket, but as he studied it, the form of a person became more apparent. It was definitely the shape of a head and shoulders at least, but all wrapped and hidden by a blanket. A grey woolen blanket, perhaps. He couldn't see any legs or feet as the seats and end partition obscured the lower half of the body. A faint suggestion of an arm could be made out from the folds and depressions in the blanket. Stranger still, Jake ascertained by its stance and posture that the figure was facing the wall, its nose all but touching it. As he looked at this shrouded figure, the train had begun to move and leave the station. A few seconds into its movement, the car suddenly jolted, as though it had lost all power. The lights in the car also flickered out for a couple of seconds. Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to Haunted UK Fiction, a sister podcast to The Haunted UK, which features original flash fiction, short stories, and novellas with paranormal themes. All stories you will hear were written by a collection of talented writers, authors, and storytellers, both independent and professional. In today's episode, we'll be reading The Last Passenger, which was sent in to us by Iain Maynard. Iain has had a lifelong obsession with all things spooky, paranormal, and horror, whether that be in books, film, television, or the theatre. In his younger days, he drew illustrations and book covers for a variety of small press magazines and books, but it's only in the past few years that he's turned his hand to writing. The Last Passenger centres around the Piccadilly Underground line, which he has travelled on all his life, and a strange event that occurred on one particular journey. Now get comfortable, grab a little something to sip on, perhaps cuddle up under a blanket to help offset the chills coming your way, and let's dive into the story. Jake Solomon was 29, single but looking, a copywriter for an online media company, hot and sticky with sweat brought on by the August heat. But above all else, right now, he was tired beyond belief. Work had been busier than he'd ever known it. The company were currently catering content for a big Hollywood film studio to promote a major new movie, and whilst Jake loved his job, the volume of work and hours spent on it were taking their toll on him. Walking from his office in Soho down towards Piccadilly Circus Underground Station, the day's heat had given way to an oppressive humidity in the evening air, which Jake was doing his best to ignore. Instead, he mentally added up the hours he'd worked that week. 62 hours at the office alone. Even then, that did not include any of the hours in front of his laptop at home. But today was Friday, and the weekend awaited. Once he was home, he was planning on climbing into his bed and sleeping through all of Saturday. Standing on the downwards escalator at Piccadilly Circus, Jake realized that he had barely any recollection of his walk from the office to that very spot, and thanked his feet for knowing where they were going when his brain clearly had no intention of helping. The station was relatively devoid of other commuters. The rush-hour surge had long since departed home for the evening, and the nighttime revellers heading to their pubs, clubs, and theatres had already journeyed in. Days of summer heat were trapped in the passageways. The accumulation of hundreds of commuters' sweat and body odour hung heavy in the muggy air. Jake headed onto the northbound platform and made his way to the usual spot where the first carriage of the train would align when stopped. He'd be travelling the length of the line, albeit the one stop before its termination, to Oakwood Station. Being in the first car afforded him a minimal walk to the station's exit stairs on its platform. Facing down the length of the platform, he scanned the notification board hanging from the ceiling for when the next train would arrive. 1 minute. He watched the second digits on its clock and counted down the final seconds. A warm, fresh breeze came up from the far end of the platform, carrying with it a faint smell of static electricity. As it blew against his cheeks, he could see the tunnel at the far end of the platform start to glow from the lights of the train as it approached the station. The train crashed and clanged as it decelerated and glided to a stop beside the platform. Jake positioned himself in front of the car's doors, ready to embark once they opened. The door slid back, and he stood to one side, allowing a couple of people to exit the car. Stepping aboard, he headed to the empty seat that he'd already eyed through the car's window as it had arrived. He always liked to sit in a seat that was designated a priority seat for elderly people, pregnant women, or those with a disability. It was near the doors, and more importantly right now, there was the glass partition by the end of the row of seats that he could lean into, alleviating the effort of having to use his muscles to sit upright. As he slumped into the seat, the tiredness of his body felt like it had actual mass. It was an additional weight dropping him into the seat. He placed his shoulder bag down onto the adjacent seat. The sweat from his body had made his shirt damp, and he had to peel it away from his skin several times to get comfortable. The carriage was dirty and old-looking. A layer of dirt desaturated the colours of everything in there. The upholstery on the seats looked tired and long past its best. An empty plastic bottle rested on the small shelf behind the seats, and a few pages from a discarded newspaper scurried about, propelled by a current of air flowing across the floor. Scanning the rest of the car, Jake could see there were only a couple of other passengers sitting further along, each one of them transfixed to the screens on their mobile phones. Not to feel left out, he dug his out from his trouser pocket and, sliding his fingers across the screen, brought it to life. The mindless scrolling would help engage his brain enough so it didn't slide into sleep, or so he thought. Abruptly, a loud beeping noise to notify that the doors were closing rang through the compartment, and the doors closed with a thunk. Jake swayed with the inertia of the train as it started to move and headed off into the tunnel. The electric motors created a low droning noise that raised in pitch as the train accelerated with speed. The car was divided into 3 sections, each separated by external doors, and Jake was the only person in his. The other end of his section was closed off by the locked driver's door. Within a couple of minutes, he'd already grown bored looking at his phone and had turned it off, but kept it in his hand, shifting and spinning the rectangular device around in his palm like a conjurer with a deck of cards. Staring across to the window opposite, he looked at his reflection in the glass. The image looking back at him had a slight double exposure effect caused by an outer window and an inner piece of glass that protected passengers from the doors sliding open or closed. He looked intently at his double reflection. Due to the downward lighting in the car and the blackness of the tunnel passing by outside, Jake's reflections gave the appearance of having no eyes, just deep shadows in his eye sockets. His disjointed dead reflections stared back at him, as they thought about all the work he'd done the past week. All the words written, all the words still to be put down. But that was not for now. He gave his mind some stern words to be silent as it started to formulate the next piece of copy that needed to be written. That could be dealt with the following week. As his mind quietened again, he could almost hear the tiredness sighing through his muscles. The train made its way through the next 2 stations fairly quickly. A few more people boarded, but again the relative scarcity of people on the platforms was noted. Even though it was a quieter part of the evening for commuter traffic, there were normally a few more people about. Jake thought this was to his sleepy advantage and hoped it would remain the case for the rest of the journey homeward. No revellers, no drunkards, just peace and quiet. He returned to staring at his empty reflections. As the train travelled along the rails with all its different hums and droning sounds, the rhythmic patterns in the noise were making Jake's attempts to not fall asleep become harder and harder. Each time he closed his eyes, it took a moment longer to open them again. If it weren't for the train decelerating, causing a pull on his body, the car's motion would have easily rocked him to sleep. Fortunately for Jake, the announcements for impending stations and alarms to notify the opening and closing of the doors would pierce through his head every few minutes, preventing him from totally succumbing to his tiredness. A couple more stations came and went. A few more people getting on, a few leaving. Even though he was nowhere near his destination, Jake made a concerted effort to rouse himself at each station, checking its name and marking it off against the journey's progress. In between, his eyes were closed more often than not. A single eyelid might raise if an unrecognizable sound penetrated his slumber. His body was feeling heavier and heavier, his head lighter and lighter. Random thoughts ran through his mind. How was he going to muster the energy to move when he needed to? Right now, the badly sprung seat he was sitting in was as good as any king-size bed. The train slowed to a stop as it entered King's Cross Station. More passengers entered the train, and the sudden increase in noise and chatter caused the eyelid to once again open, Jake's single active eye darting around to scan his surroundings. After a moment, the eye deemed it to be all safe and well, and retreated behind its cover. A group of 4 young adults had boarded, and instead of occupying vacant seats, of which there were numerous, they chose to stand and gathered in the space by the doors furthest away from him. They were not overly loud, but were clearly in good spirits, and there was plenty of laughter coming from them, which played as background noise as Jake slumped ever so slightly more, his sweaty arms sticking to the glass partition he leant against. The distant spoken words being heard and blurring into white noise, Jake was just about aware of the passing through of 2 more stops on the line, having already given up on visually checking his progress. As Jake's eyelids closed tighter, he was contemplating how much of an inconvenience it would be to fall asleep and miss his stop. Whilst this would be only 1 additional stop before the train terminated, the contemplation of then waiting and getting on another train to get back to this station or an additional walk to get home was not worth it for the sake of sleeping now. The thought helped summon a small reserve of energy, and opening his eyes, he adjusted himself and straightened up in the seat. As he did so, the train was decelerating to the next station, Arsenal. The train skated along the edge of the deserted platform, slowing to a stop. Over the car's speaker system an announcement was made. The voice was half muffled, but Jake could make out that it was saying that Southgate Station was closed, so the train would not be stopping there, which was of no concern to him, as that was the station before his. The doors shushed open. No one got on. The group of 4 remained where they were. As the train sat there, Jake looked out onto the dimly lit platform. The tiled decor on the platform walls still bearing the station's original name, Gillespie Road. It was renamed many years back after the football team whose stadium was now located on the ground above. With its original name still plastered throughout the platform, It looked as though it was not prepared to give up its history. The beeping to signify the doors closing sounded, and within moments the train was picking up speed and leaving the station, the tempo of its engines rising to match its acceleration. Jake kept himself upright and alert as best he could. He realized that throughout the journey, and on those moments of near-complete unconsciousness, he was still holding onto his phone. It was a miracle that he hadn't dropped it, or worse still, have someone gently take it from him. He convinced himself that if someone had, he would have noticed, but he also knew that was a lie, had he fallen asleep. As the train hurtled on, Jake returned to gazing at his strange split reflections in the window opposite. He wasn't sure if it was the dimming light, but they seemed more distant, looking more out of focus, less like him. The figures in the glass gently swayed with the movement of the travelling car, reminiscent of weeds on a riverbed, being pushed and pulled by water. The rhythmic movements made Jake's muscles weaken again. His shoulders were weighing him down. He found he was slightly slumped again, his eyelids becoming heavy once more. Waves of exhaustion pulsed through his body. He made a concerted effort to regain his focus and pulled himself up again. He needed to shift his gaze away from his gently swaying ghosts in the glass, their gentle floating starting to hypnotize him. He turned on his phone again and started looking through the same pictures and messages he'd been looking through not long before. He just needed to concentrate on something. A slight shift in movement throughout his body told him that the train was slowing down to its next stop, Finsbury Park. This was a main junction for the overground railway, and Jake was hopeful to be welcoming more passengers on and cause enough of a distraction to keep him awake. The train stopped, and the doors opened. He was not in luck. Nobody boarded the train, and the group of 4 exited. Jake now sat alone in the car. As the doors shut, he noticed an object leaning up against the wall by the furthest doors where the 4 had disembarked. Had they left something behind? Jake hadn't noticed it before, but one of them standing there could well have obscured it from his view. As he looked at it, he wondered, is that a person? At first sight, it looked like something had been wrapped in a sheet or blanket, but as he studied it, the form of a person became more apparent. It was definitely the shape of a head and shoulders at least, but all wrapped and hidden by a blanket. A grey woolen blanket, perhaps? He couldn't see any legs or feet as the seats and end partition obscured the lower half of the body. A faint suggestion of an arm could be made out from the folds and depressions in the blanket. Stranger still, Jake ascertained by its stance and posture that the figure was facing the wall, its nose all but touching it. As he looked at this shrouded figure, the train had begun to move and leave the station. A few seconds into its movement, the car suddenly jolted, as though it had lost all power. The lights in the car also flickered out for a couple of seconds. When they reignited, what Jake saw left him dumbfounded. The figure was exactly in the same place as moments before, but the carriage looked completely different. The light was warmer, softer. The cold grey of the interior, all metal and plastic, had been replaced by rich, brown wooden panelling and flooring. Green handrails ran along the length of the carriage. Hand grips made of large springs hung along the ceiling. The drab blue and grey patterned upholstery on the seats was replaced with a deep red and black checkered pattern. This was not the carriage Jake had been sitting in. This was something out of time. He only had a second to take it all in, as there was another jolt of the train, another flickering of the lights. And the carriage had returned to how it had looked seconds before. Cold, grey, and dirty. Jake took a moment to gather his thoughts and try to fathom what he'd just witnessed. Then he remembered the figure. There it was, just as it had been when he first saw it, exactly in the same spot, motionless, unaffected by the motions of the carriage. The train picked up speed again. Jake tried to figure out a rational explanation. There was only one conclusion to make. He had drifted off to sleep again for a moment. The lurching of the train woke him up suddenly, and his brain was not completely computing what he saw. Maybe. That gave no answer to the person at the other end of the carriage, though. He looked at it again, trying to formulate a reason for what and why a person may be standing there like that. Could he really be sure it was a person? It was only minutes since he first noticed it, and it hadn't moved once. Maybe it was nothing more than a pile of junk, or a mannequin of some kind that someone had left behind by accident, or on purpose to get rid of. He was certain that he hadn't seen anyone put it there, but then he had been certain that his eyes hadn't been closed for more than a few seconds at a time. But that notion was dwindling by the second. If it was someone, he didn't really want to be caught staring at them, so returned to looking at his phone. Either way, it unnerved him. The train pulled into its next station, and Jake tried to get a sideways glance down the car to see if the figure reacted to the train stopping. From what he could see, there was no movement. The doors opened. The train sat there patiently for a minute or so. Nobody got on board. The figure remained still. The doors closed. The train started to move again. The curiosity of this person had Jake's attention and was enough to keep him awake. Just wondering if, at some point, they might move was enough to keep him alert. He continued to do his best not to stare at them, for he had decided it was definitely a they and not an it. He kept himself as much face forward as he could, but with them still in the corner most of his eye. As he wondered why a person would be standing in such an obscure position on an otherwise empty carriage, he started to think about the story this would become when retelling it to friends. His late-night journey on the underground, with some weirdo standing facing the wall. He needed proof for this tale yet to be told. He took his phone and engaged its camera. Slowly and carefully, he tried to maneuver the phone's camera lens into a position to take a photograph, without it looking at all like he was taking one. With the phone screen at a steep angle to his eyeline, Jake did his best to get the person into frame. He took a few shots, then opened the phone's gallery app to see what he had taken. From the restricted angle he had taken the images, he'd managed to cover the area where the figure stood. But there was something wrong. The photographs were not of the sharpest quality, yet the interior of the car could be clearly seen. The seats, rails, the advertisements above the windows could all clearly be made out. The person, however, couldn't. There was something there, but it was hard to define its shape. It looked like a light had reflected off the glass partition it stood behind, causing a glare across the part of the picture where the figure stood. Jake looked at the other photos he'd taken, but they all showed the same image. Maybe the flash on his phone was switched to on, and that had caused the glare. He looked at his settings, but it was definitely off. Jake contemplated trying to take another photo, but the train slowed down into the next station, distracting him. The platform for Turnpike Lane was desolate. Was he really the only person travelling tonight, he wondered? Well, him and this person approximately 20 feet away. He watched the doors close again, and the station slid away as the train moved forward. The thought of taking another photo returned, and he readied his phone to take another picture. The tiredness was now starting to reassert itself, and Jake had to pay more attention to what he was doing. He lined up the phone again, squinting at the screen to make sure he had the image he desired. It was the briefest of seconds looking at the screen that he saw the figure was no longer there. He whipped his head round and looked to the corner where the figure had been. The phone screen hadn't lied. The figure was gone. Maybe they had gotten off the train whilst Jake was distracted by the empty platform. The following second was nowhere near as brief as the one before. It seemed to take an age for Jake to turn his head around and see that the figure was now standing stock still, facing the opposite wall to where it had been. The feelings of confusion in him made way to feelings of dread. The figure remained stock still, facing the carriage wall. But Jake had the feeling that this person was now somehow watching him. He lost all pretense of not looking and was now staring fixedly at them. As the train hurtled through the tunnel, Jake felt a strange stillness. He could still feel the motion of the train, but now it felt as though everything was moving slower, as if the air had become water, more effort needed to move against its resistance. Jake rubbed his eyes, as they too had become affected by this change to the atmosphere, with everything becoming slightly blurred. He gave up trying to take any more photographs on his phone. The effort to focus his eyes clearly had become too much. He slid the phone back into his pocket, whilst he stared down the car towards the figure. He tried to reason with himself that if he kept on looking at them, they wouldn't move again. Flashes of colour caught the attention of his peripheral vision as the train entered the next station. Jake's gaze turned to the window to see the train aligning with the station. Outside of the car, it all looked normal. Another dimly lit platform, grey and dirty from churned-up dust, debris and human sweat. He returned his gaze to the figure. It was still there, still motionless. He listened to the familiar beeps, bleeps and whooshing of the doors going through the performance of opening. Nobody boarded. The figure didn't move. He didn't move. Everything remained motionless until the call of the door's closing notification sounded. On the last bleep, the doors clashed closed violently. The crashing sound distracted him and drew his attention away to see if they were still intact. His eyes quickly scanned the doors to see they were totally unaffected. The car set in motion again. His eyes darted back to the figure. It was still in its same spot, but something had changed. It was still standing there, but now there was a hand pressed up against the partition glass. It appeared through a fold in the blanket. It was small. The fingers splayed out across the glass were slender. Despite its size, he determined that they were not that of a child's, but a woman's. The little finger looked slightly bent out of position, possibly broken. The other thing he was quick to notice was that there was a redness to the whole hand, as if freshly bruised or covered in small cuts. Jake re-evaluated the situation. It was a woman, and maybe she had been in an accident. Maybe, God forbid, she'd been a victim of some kind of assault or abuse. Should he go and talk to her? Check to see if she was okay? He thought maybe a strange man approaching would make matters worse for her, so he decided to watch her from afar, and provided nothing changed, he'd keep that distance. She was clearly injured somehow, but was okay, and didn't need his assistance, he convinced himself. Once he'd made this decision, the slight anxiety that had risen in him started to dissipate. As these thoughts went through his mind, a normality started to return. The scenario he'd created for her was fiction, but based in a reality he could understand and rationalize. As he relaxed back into his chair, his attention returned to the tiredness in his joints and muscles. The air still felt thick, and his vision still caused objects to blur around the edges, but his new calmness made this less of a concern. As the train cruised through the tunnel to its next destination, Jake kept his vigil on the woman. Several minutes passed, and he found it remarkable that she could keep so perfectly still. The motions of the train didn't affect her. It was as if she was part of the train. Her hand, too, remained in its fixed posture, like a giant spider stuck to the glass, lying in wait. A twinge of anxiety flashed across his body again. The train once again began to slow as it made its way to the next station. Jake looked out of the window to see where he was now. The signage on the station announcing Bounds Green. Mentally, he counted off how many more stations there were to go until his destination of Oakwood. 3 more stops. As the train pulled to a stop, it was apparent yet again that this was another station devoid of commuters. Jake wondered if there was anybody else now on the train apart from the two of them. He looked to the end of the car and scanned the window in the door that led to the next compartment. From its limited aperture, he could see no one. He returned his view to the woman as the train pulled out of the station. She was still standing in the same spot, but her posture had changed ever so slightly. Her shoulder was now slightly twisted towards him, and her hand had moved from its spot on the glass. It was now gripping the vertical handrail that was positioned alongside the glass partition. It gripped the rail tightly, and Jake could clearly see that the knuckles were bloodied and bruised. Part of her arm was now withdrawn from under her coverings. The forearm, too, was covered in what looked like fresh cuts and bruises. The arm had smears of what appeared to be dirt or grease along it. Jake noticed that the fingers were moving. This was the first indication that he had actually witnessed that she might be alive. Whilst still gripping the handrail, her fingers were slowly drumming against the bar, rhythmic and precise, as someone lost in thought might do. What was she thinking? Was she planning something? The train gained its speed again. Its wheels screamed as they spun on the metal tracks. Then she moved. Not a subtle movement, but a bold shift. The muscles in her hand and forearm tensed. The grip on the handrail tightened, then with deliberate force, pulled her body out from behind the partition in a jolting motion. Jake could now see her from head to toe. She was small, just over 5 feet in height, and petite. The grey blanket that shrouded the figure seemed more tattered than he'd noticed before. More creases, more dirt. Scuff marks covered its surface. There was a gap where her face would be, but Jake could make out no features as the shroud cast a heavy shadow across the face. The blanket fell just below her knees, and Jake could see the damage that covered her arm was matched on her legs. The calves were partially covered by stockings, but with so many holes in them, the legs looked like they were draped in spiders' webs. Both had the same intensity of cuts, bruises, and dirt. The right leg bowed out slightly away from the body, its foot bare. The left foot had a shoe on it. It was old-fashioned looking, dirty green in colour, with a low heel which affected the woman's stance. Jake stared at her, trying to absorb all the evidence of her, trying desperately to fathom what could have caused her to be in this state. Whilst he had been scrutinising the figure before him, it had escaped his attention that the train had stopped at another station and was already speeding back on its way. The figure remained still for a few moments. Although her face was lost in shadow, Jake knew she was looking straight at him. He looked back into the black void where her face was hidden, desperately trying to find some familiarity of features in its darkness. He was aware of the speed of the train through his body, but he couldn't move. He was transfixed. The figure made another move. It was so fast, it made Jake's muscles spasm in surprise. She lunged forward, making a step towards him. The lights of the car started to flicker again. The lights danced across her, making her silhouette somehow more imposing, threatening. She made another step, then another. The steps were small and awkwardly placed. Jake could make out a sound that resembled twigs being crunched and snapped, as if trodden on. Was this the sound of brittle, broken bones grating against each other within her flesh as she moved? The bruised and bloodied legs seemed to be barely holding up the weight of the woman's body. With each step she swayed and rocked, looking like her legs may give out at any moment. With each step closer to Jake, he could see that her shroud was decayed and rotten. Her limbs appeared more fragile, yet somehow stronger as they made their way to him. The purples and reds of her bruises and cuts were vibrant and fresh, the wounds open and wet. Jake's heart was now thumping in his chest so hard it felt like it could burst out of his ribcage at any moment. Anxiety had given way to sheer terror as he watched the shrouded body slowly make its way down the carriage. The lights continued to flicker, creating harsh shadows as she approached. one flash of light, and Jake thought he had finally caught a glimpse of her face, but he could only make out a raw red color instead of any features. His brain was desperately trying to cling on to rationality and reality. Even with his gaze fixed on the approaching figure, his eyes darted about the car, trying to assess an escape. The train must surely be stopping at the next station at any moment. No sooner than the thought had entered his head, the train started to slow. Light burst in through the windows as the train entered the next station. As it slowed, Jake readied himself. He pulled his bag to his side and readied to leap to the doors when they opened. Then he would be on the platform. Then he would run. Just run. The train was almost at a full stop. He took his eyes from the strange, grotesque figure, who by now was halfway down the carriage towards him, and he eyed the doors. Any second, the train would stop. The doors would open, and he would be running. The drone of the engines fell silent, and the car slowed almost to a halt. But within a second, the droning sound picked up again. The doors did not open. The train started to accelerate again. The station slipped out of view as the train shuttled back into the tunnel. A pathetic "no" whispered from his lips as the closed Southgate station and hope of an escape disappeared into the distance. The figure continued with its slow, painful, and shambolic walk towards him. Though her face was hidden, he could sense it smiling at him, an evil, maleficent sneer as he sat there trapped. Jake could no longer control his panic. He desperately tried to think of his options. The woman was half his size, bloodied and bruised, unsteady on her feet. Surely he could just get up and with all his force push her down. But like the rabbit fixed by the headlights of an oncoming car, he just froze. Without reason, he knew that to touch her would reveal some further horror that he couldn't contemplate. He could run down to the driver's door and bang on it to try and get help. But what if the driver didn't hear him? He would be completely trapped and cornered. Then the irrational thoughts took hold. Is there even a driver? The woman made several more uneasy steps towards him, moving ever closer, her arm out now in front of her, raised, her fingers stretched and spread wide. Her nails were chipped and broken, the flesh on several knuckles stripped to the bone. It was only a matter of time before the hand was grabbing hold of him. There was a sudden shift of air pressure within the car, as the train exited the tunnel and was now travelling outside above ground. As the air shifted, he could now smell her. A mixed odour of ammonia, iron, sweat and raw meat filled his nostrils, getting stronger with each broken step she made towards him. The acrid stink sent a wave of nausea over him. As the shrouded figure shuffled ever closer to Jake, he noticed the train had started slowing down again. The station was approaching. His station. Would the train stop this time? Would the doors open? Would he be able to escape this monster that was now only a couple of meters from him? He had been sitting still in one position for what felt like an eternity, and he feared that his legs would not be able to move him when he needed them to. He tensed all his muscles, forcing every last ounce of lethargy from his body. The figure took another few steps, the sounds of her broken bones disintegrating within her body. The train was now slowing into the station. Jake kept his attention on the figure before him. His route to the door was set, his eyes darting swiftly between the two. He just needed the speed to avoid the woman's touch. The train came to a standstill, and Jake pleaded silently for the doors to open. The figure made another fumbled step. She only had to make a few more to cut off his escape. Then, with a whoosh of noise, the doors opened. Jake leapt from his seat and launched himself to the exit. He glimpsed the woman's bloodied fingers lunging at his face, mere inches from him, but he quickly turned and maneuvered his body away and escaped her touch. His seat to the outside of the train was only 5 large strides away, and it was on the last step that the carriage doors had already begun to close. As his feet hit the concrete of the station platform, he heard the doors shut behind him. He spun around to see if his pursuer had got off with him. He was alone. She was still in the carriage, trapped behind its doors. The train just sat there, and he feared that the doors would open again, and yet he still stood, looking at this bizarre and twisted figure. She too held her spot, facing him. Her arm now dropped and was retreating under the blanket, looking as if it were covered by the rot of 50 years. The air had become deathly still. Time had stopped at that moment. Jake inhaled deep lungfuls of warm air as he looked at his tormentor behind the glass. There was a slight movement from her, and the blanket shrouding her face slid back to uncover what was hiding underneath. What remained of her hair was lank and matted, caked with what looked like dried blood and dirt. Her eyes could not be seen. The eyelids surrounding the skin were severely bruised and swollen. Thin indentations where her bruised eyelids met was all that could be seen to show any evidence that she had eyes. The flesh now just bulged out of her brow. The nose was bent from a severe break, and covering the lower half of her face were several deep and raw cuts, nearly all travelling vertically up and down her cheeks and mouth. As she revealed herself, she tilted her head and her face contorted, the swollen and torn muscles pulling, widening her mouth into a broad, menacing smile. The cuts across her face opened and concertinaed out, gaps appearing in the glistening flesh, widening and showing the cracked teeth and raw gums that lay inside her mouth. The horror of her face burned itself into Jake's retinas. The true terror of his encounters stood before him. The train's engines sparked to life, and it slowly made its way out of the platform. Jake remained fixed to the spot, watching the carriage slide away from him. Looking into the car, the woman remained in her spot, frozen and lifeless again. The lights inside the car flashed brightly, and the interior had changed again, as it had done earlier. The drab greys and blues had changed back into the rich browns and greens. The red and black of the upholstery looked fresh and new. That was not the last extraordinary image Jake witnessed on that train, though. As the carriages moved past him, he could see, dotted throughout the remaining carriages, figures were standing in the aisles, but they were not people, not whole people. They were almost shadows, similar to the reflections he'd been looking at of himself in the glass of the carriage. These were not reflections, though, not tricks in the glass. They definitely stood within the cars. Women, men, young and old, all staring out of the train at the world outside, their eyes lost in shadows, their souls lost forever. The last car slid past Jake, causing a light backdraft of breeze over his body. The train was gone. She was gone. Jake remained where he was, stood at the edge of the platform, feet stuck to the ground, his eyes staring at the now empty space to where she had been. Seconds passed, giving way to minutes. Stillness had come over him. The strange events of the last half hour of his life flashed through his mind. His brain was hopelessly trying to process what had happened. "Is everything all right, sir?" The voice came from behind him, and startled Jake back into reality and time. "Everything okay?" The voice came again. Jake turned around to see a member of the station staff behind him. The man's uniform rumpled, sleeves rolled up his arms, and cap pushed to the back of his head. He was middle-aged, his skin moist from a day's sweat, and he gave Jake a gentle smile as he asked his question. He was so normal and real. Jake thought about what he'd been asked. Of course everything was not all right, but how could he explain what he'd just been through? Yes, I was all he could muster in response. "Okay, sir. How about we just take a few steps away from the edge of the platform?" "Oh, yes. Oh, wait, no, I wasn't going to jump." "Of course not, sir, but we'd best be safe," responded the station guard, his training for such situations helping his voice remain calm. Jake took several steps towards the centre of the platform. "No, really, I wasn't going to jump, but I was just on the train and something happened. Something just wrong." He looked down to the end of the platform that disappeared into the darkness of the night, and then back at the station guard. She was... He tried, but Jake couldn't form the words to even begin to explain what he'd seen. The station guard gave him a knowing look as Jake stumbled over his words. He glanced at his watch, acknowledging what he saw, and slightly leant in towards him. "Did you see her?" he said under his breath. The guard studied Jake's face intently as he asked the question. "You did? You did see her? She often shows up around this time." Who the hell is she?" Jake exclaimed. A slight smile came across the guard's face. "This line, well, all of the underground lines have so many stories of ghosts. On the trains and haunting the platforms. As incredulous as the idea suggested, ghost was not Jake's first idea of what could have happened. Ghost? It couldn't be. But how? What did she look like, sir? Was she covered in a dirty sheet? Was she all covered in cuts? Did her face look like a lump of steak that a butcher had taken out their anger on?" As Jake heard the description, the realization solidified. "Yes," whispered Jake in response, feeling defeated by the ridiculous notion. Then a wave of questions flooded his brain. "But was she? How did she get like that? What does she want? Why was she after me?" "Don't rightly know, sir. She's been seen on the trains around about this time of night for years. All the way back to the 1930s, in fact. One story goes that she was a jumper. A suicide. Some young lass that jumped straight in front of a train as it entered Finsbury Park, causing all those cuts and bruises. But the truth is, there has been so many jumpers over the years. Well, who knows? Don't know her real name, but she's had the nickname Split-Head Sally for the longest time." "Split-Head Sally?" "Yes, sir. On account of her... The guard pointed to his face and made a circular motion. "Have you seen her?" Jake asked. "Me? No, sir. I've worked at this station for 22 years and I've never seen her once. I've heard a ton of stories over the years, though, from those who have. Bloody glad I haven't, mind. She sounds terrifying." "Yes, she is," Jake responded flatly, still processing the events, not being able to pinpoint the emotion he should be feeling. "Who were the other people on the train? The ones that looked kind of like shadows?" Jake asked. "Shadows? That's a new one on me, sir," the guard pondered. "Maybe they're the spirits of all the people Sally caught," he responded, a chuckle in his voice as he tried to make light of it, giving Jake a wink of the eye. Jake saw no humour in it at all. "Well, I'd better get home," he said, starting towards the platform stairwell which led to the station's exit. "Yes, sir. Good night, and sleep well. Don't let Split-Head Sally get to you." Laughter still hung in the guard's voice as he bid Jake farewell. Jake exited out of the station and started the walk back to his flat. His body ached. The bag over his shoulder weighed him down. He wanted to be home and in his bed. When he'd gotten onto that train, he was tired beyond belief, and he was still. But now he doubted he would ever sleep again. The guard's last words to him repeated over and over in his head. "Don't let Split-Head Sally get to you." That brings us to the end of this episode. We truly hope you enjoyed this terrifying tale by Iain Maynard. If you'd like to hear more from Iain, he is currently working on various short stories and 2 novels, all in the supernatural genre. You can get in touch with him using the contact information in the show's notes. If you have an original story that would send a chill down our spines and you would like to submit it for review, simply send it in to hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. That's hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. Until the next time, stay safe and take care.